If you have been looking for a good gluten-free sourdough bread recipe that has minimal steps and minimal ingredients, then look no further. This beautiful artisan gluten-free sourdough bread is so easy to make. I've been making a loaf a week for quite some time now. I absolutely love it. I love my routine with this. It does not require many ingredients because of this bad boy right here. This is the Bob's Red Mill gluten-free 1-to-1 baking flour. When I was starting to get into gluten-free sourdough, I ran into so many bread recipes, had like 10 different flours, like 20 different ingredients. And I don't know who has the pantry space for that. It's like impossible to stay stocked up on everything. So the only flour I use is this one right here. It is a blend of sweet white rice flour, whole grain brown rice flour, potato starch, whole grain sorghum flour, tapioca flour, and xanthan gum. Now it does already have xanthan gum in it, but I add just a little bit more. I found that adding just a little bit more to my recipe really makes the dough hold together well, be shapeable, and just result in some better bread. If you have already made sourdough that is not gluten-free, this is going to look different because there's no kneading involved once the dough is made. This is obviously gluten-free, so we're not going to be developing any gluten through the stretch and folds and kneading and any of that. So that's one thing I love about it. It's just so easy to make. All right, let's just go ahead and jump into the recipe. I use a kitchen scale to bake my bread, and you guys do not have to be intimidated by kitchen scales. I got this one on Amazon, and you just zero it out and then put the correct amounts of ingredient in. It's no big deal at all. So first I'm just adding my dry ingredients, which are 440 grams of flour, 5 grams of xanthan gum, 15 grams of sea salt, giving that a little mix. And then moving on to my wet ingredients, I use 200 grams of active gluten-free sourdough starter. Now I fed this right when I woke up in the morning, and then I always make my dough in the afternoon. I add 10 grams of olive oil and then 360 grams of filtered or bottled water, and then I just move my dough to my KitchenAid mixer on the dough hook. I mix it until it looks about like this. Sometimes I have to scrape down the sides or something. Feel free to add a tad more flour or tad more water. If the consistency is off or something, it can be a tad flexible. So then in my bowl, I'm just adding some olive oil and dusting with flour. And then I'm moving my dough into the bowl. I had a little flour on the bottom, so that's why I just kind of messed with it a little bit to get that last bit of flour in there. And I'm not really shaping or anything. I'm just going to let it rise in my bowl. So moving the dough over, and then I leave it on the counter really until bedtime, so 6 to 8 hours. And then before I go to bed, I move it to the fridge for 10 to 12 hours. So I cover it with just some saran wrap, and it can just sit on my counter and then move to the fridge before bed. In the morning, the first thing I do is preheat my oven to 450 with the Dutch oven in it. If you have convention bake on your oven, I would go ahead and use that. I usually do. And now I'm going to grab my dough and I am going to shape it. So on my surface, I'm just flouring my surface, and then I'm going to spread my dough kind of flat and roll it into a ball by grabbing the edges and pulling them towards the center. So you do definitely need some flour because otherwise this can be sticky, but if you have flour, this is really not hard at all. Sometimes once I flip my dough over, if there is a little crack in the dough or something, I'll just put a little filtered water on my fingers and then just kind of smooth it over. If you do have any big cracks in your dough while it's baking, it can rise there, and so it'll just come out not quite as pretty. So as you can see, I had one kind of imperfection right there. So I just put a little filtered water on some fingers and just kind of smoothed it over. It doesn't need to look perfect or anything, but any big cracks can make it rise just not quite as pretty. So then I'm just going to flour my dough and I'm going to score it. I don't usually score it using any fancy designs or anything. I just usually do the standard X, I guess, and it's worked out well. Maybe I'll get fancy later on. My recipe does have a long proofing time, but the flavor that it results in is just so absolutely delicious. I feel like once you get used to the taste of sourdough, you start to crave it. If I run out of sourdough before I make my next loaf, I start to absolutely crave it. That sourdough taste is just absolutely delicious. Now, once the dough is scored, I'm going to put the dough with the floured parchment paper in my Dutch oven and cover it. I'm going to bake it for 40 minutes at 450 degrees. After that, I just remove the cover, I turn it down to 425, and I bake for another about 35 minutes. So depending on your oven, how long you bake it uncovered might differ. If your oven runs hot, maybe check it right at 30 minutes, if not a little earlier. You do want the inside of your bread to be at least 200 degrees before you quit baking. If you quit baking before that, you might end up with a really gummy bread. Also, it's really important you don't cut into it until it is completely cooled. So I'd suggest not cutting into it at least 4 hours after baking. That way you know it has had plenty of time to cool. It's going to keep kind of cooking while it is cooling down. I like to let my bread cool just on a rack. And look how pretty this turned out. Oh my goodness, this was so delicious. This is great for sandwiches, for toast, for really any sourdough bread needs. It has now been plenty of time since my bread came out of the oven. It is not warm to the touch anymore, so let's cut into it. Oh my goodness, that is beautiful. So I absolutely love the texture of this bread. The crust is slightly crunchy, and then the center is moist and a little bit chewy. I absolutely love that. I think it is so delicious. But if the little bit chewy isn't your thing, you can do two things. One, you can just eat it toasted, or two, you can cook it an extra 10 minutes. Then your crust might be a little extra crunchy, but it should be fine. This recipe is pretty versatile if you are out and about and you need a little bit of a longer or shorter proofing time on the counter or in the fridge. It's probably going to be fine. You can also shape your dough before you put it in the fridge, and you can put it in one of these Banneton baskets, and then it'll come with these beautiful indentations of the edges. That's kind of a fun way to do. You can shape it differently. You can shape it kind of longer. And same thing, you can shape it before the refrigeration step and put it in one of these longer baskets, or you can just shape it into a longer loaf before you bake it like I normally do. I actually used to shape my dough right after I made it, and then I would just let it sit on the counter, sit on the fridge, score it, bake it. And it did work fine. The crust just wasn't quite as pretty. Sometimes there were little cracks in it, so it would rise in those areas and not just the places where I scored it. So I would recommend doing your shaping just either before your refrigeration step or right before baking. This little loaf makes at least 10 slices of beautiful sourdough bread that is great for sandwiches or toast, French toast, making croutons later, whatever you want to do. My usual routine is I make a loaf on a Thursday or Friday. I put it in, I put it in this thing for 2 or 3 days, definitely over the weekend. And then I put it in a bag and put it in the fridge. Because there's no preservatives, it's not going to last as long as something you bought at the store, obviously. So I would give it 3 or 4 days out on the counter, definitely a week in the fridge. You can definitely also slice them up, have some in the freezer, take them out and toast them. Definitely check out my blog post. It's in the description box, and it has an option where you can print out my recipe for free. So if you want to add that to your recipes or stick it on the fridge, definitely go for it. I also have a blog post about how I made my gluten-free starter. Let me show you that. I did a no discard method until it was active, so it was super easy to do. It took me 7 days probably until it was active enough to bake with. Same thing, I was looking for an easy option, and it worked totally fine, and it worked totally fine with this flour. So check out that blog post too. Okay, that will be it for this video. I hope it was helpful to you. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you just want to chat, leave me a comment in the comment section. I try to always reply on there, and I'd love to hear what you guys had to say. If you're new to my channel, I would love if you subscribed. Please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps my channel. Feel free to also connect with me on social media. I'd love if you popped over and said hi. And I will see you in my next video.